So having discussed the concept of environmental history and having identified the major themes in environmental history, now let us try to understand human society or the historical evolution of human society by taking into account the modes of resource use. Here I am referring to Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha's book This Fissured Land. In the first chapter of this book, This Fissured Land, Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha try to examine the evolution of human society or evolution of human history by taking into account different modes of resource use. That how human society in the process of evolution, starting from the hunting and food gathering stage to that of the capitalistic society, how human society in different periods of evolution, in different periods of human history have used resources differently. While trying to examine patterns of resource use or modes of resource use, Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha tries to make an ecological critique of Marxian concept of modes of production. As we know that modes of production may be defined as a sum total of relations of production and forces of production, where mode of production or modes of production in the Marxian sense basically discusses relations of production in the sense that how human societies or how different classes, how different groups are related to each other in the context of a production system or in the context of a production base. For example, when industry becomes a forces of production, industry becomes the base of production, how human societies are related to each other in context of industry, or in other words, whether somebody owns the industry or somebody works in the industry. So therefore, based on the nature of ownership, human societies may be divided into different classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Similarly, with respect to the ownership of land in the context of farm or in the context of agricultural production, with regard to the ownership of land, human societies may be divided into different categories. So therefore, mode of production, while trying to understand human society, while trying to understand evolution of human society, history of human society, tries to understand or tries to do so by examining relationship between classes, relationship between human groups. But the major problem that Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha identifies with this Marxian concept of modes of production is that while in modes of production the infrastructure becomes important or the forces of production becomes important, but mode of production tries to undermine or tries to neglect the fact that these infrastructure or these forces of production are ultimately embedded in different ecological contexts. When we understand or when we try to examine industry as a forces of production, or when Marxian sense or Marxian perspective tries to understand class relations in industrial context, it is also important to understand that industry is embedded in a specific ecological context. Similarly, when Marxian sociology or when Marxian perspective tries to understand class in the agrarian context, it is also important to understand that agriculture or farming practices is embedded in a specific ecological context. But however, the mode of production concept tries to undermine or tries to neglect the ecological base upon which these modes of production are embedded. So therefore, Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil say that mode of resource use is perhaps a better framework to understand evolution of human history. Like the Marxian concept of historical materialism divides the human society or tries to understand human society or the evolution of human society through different phases like primitive communism, slavery, agrarian mode of production or agrarian society and industrial society. Likewise, Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha tries to or they attempt to understand evolution of human history by classifying human society into different modes of resource use, and according to them, mode of resource use is a better concept to understand evolution of human history because mode of resource use identifies the ecological base upon which these modes of production are embedded. It also identifies the ecological ideology that governs these modes and the ecological impact of these modes. Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil identifies 4 modes of resource use: the gathering, the nomadic pastoralism, settled agriculture and industrialism, and tries to see that what are the different between these modes of resource use with respect to their use or their relationship with nature. And these four modes of resource use are classified or distinguished from each other based on the technology that they use, the economy that prevails in these modes of resource use, the social organization, and most importantly, the ideology and ecological impact of these organizations. So let us see what are these four modes of resource use and how they can be differentiated from each other. So the first mode of resource use that Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha identifies is that of the gathering mode of resource use. As I just pointed out that it is the ideology and impact which are the two most aspects of modes of resource use. The gathering mode of resource use can be characterized with its natural economy. The resource flow in gathering mode is limited to a very limited spatial area, very limited geographical area, and therefore gathering mode tries to, or it produced an ideology where human beings were considered as a part of the larger community. So in the gathering mode, when the main source of energy was that of human muscle power, or the main source of economy was that of gathering food and hunting animals, the ideology that governed the society, or the ideology that governed the relationship with nature, was that human beings were considered as a part of the larger community, and nature was not considered as a subject to human control, and human society attributed different sacred elements or sacredness to nature and practiced different kinds of restraints, and this kind of ideology or this kind of ecological ideology resulted in a low levels of ecological impact in gathering mode. In other words, we can summarize that gathering mode was a kind of modes of resource use where the main activity was that of food gathering and hunting, and where the ideology of society was that of considering human society as a part of nature, considering humans as a part of larger community which includes both biotic and the abiotic community, and therefore the impact upon nature was relatively low. The second mode of resource use that Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha point out is that of nomadic pastoralism. In nomadic pastoralism, humans become nomads or communities become nomads. They try to domesticate animals, and their social organization also increases to larger kinship groups. And the major source of energy in this nomadic pastoralism is the animal power. So therefore, the ideology that a nomadic pastoralism mode of resources produces is that considering humans as separate from nature. Because nomadic pastoralism was not a settled community where community used to wander around, community used to move from one place to another place, and they had large hordes, large animals. In that mode of resource use, Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil points out that human society could not develop any kind of affiliation with nature, any kind of closeness with nature. So therefore, it was in that mode of resource use that human society was considered separate from nature, and this kind of ideology and this kind of economic organization produced or they produced a gradual overgrazing. So perhaps what Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil point out, that ecological degradation started from the nomadic pastoralism, because in nomadic pastoralism human society could not associate themselves with the nature because they were not settled in any particular place. They were wanderers, they used to move from place to place. So therefore, perhaps one of the way in which they could ensure their sustenance is by degrading a new area when resources were depleted from one particular area. So they used to move from place to place, and therefore natural degradation of natural resources or overgrazing emerged or started from this mode of resource use. The third mode of resource use, which is perhaps one of the important mode of resource use in their frame of understanding human society, is that of settled cultivation. Settled cultivation was a phase when human beings started domesticating animals and plants, and agriculture emerged as the dominant economic activity, and that resulted in large scale alterations of modes of resource use. large scale alterations of the land use pattern. Forests were cleared and different kinds of land use patterns were cleared to convert them as agricultural land, and human society emerged as settled cultivators. So therefore there was a greater demand for agricultural land, there was a greater demand for more production, and human society was also, population was also increasing, and that had a different kind of or that resulted in emergence of a different kind of ideology and different kind of impact on nature. When we speak about ideology in settled cultivation, even though human society established control over nature, even though human society domesticated nature and animals, but yet human society was still considered as subject to natural calamities or to vulnerabilities of nature, and therefore humans perceived themselves as one of the larger community or one among the community of being, because by then society has settled. They are not migrants, they are not wanderers like the nomadic pastoralism. They are settled communities, they are settled agriculturalists, and therefore they started developing a kind of affinity with land. They started developing a kind of affinity with this place or with the surrounding that they are residing. So gradually a kind of symbiotic relationship emerged with nature. In contrast to its previous mode, the nomadic pastoralism, where human society could not establish a kind of affinity with nature, kind of closeness with nature, in settled agriculture, even though human society started altering the nature, but a gradual symbiotic relationship emerged with nature, and human society considered themselves as part of the larger community, which included both the biotic and the non-biotic world, which included both the human societies, the human population, and the surroundings or the trees and the animals, the rivers, the mountains, all were considered as part of the larger society. Perhaps it was the time when different kind of symbiotic relationship, different kind of symbolism was introduced with related to nature. Human beings started relating themselves with nature. So there was personifications of nature. A particular tree was considered in a particular manner. A particular kind of river were considered in a particular manner. So human society started worshipping the trees, worshipping the nature, worshipping the rivers. In other words, society realized that even though it controls the nature, even though it can domesticate the nature, but society's sustenance depends largely upon nature, because human society is subject to the vulnerabilities of the nature. And with regard to the ecological impact of settled cultivation, Guha mentions that by this time ecological impact has become intermediate. It was neither severe nor low, because human society has settled, and the settled agrarian society has developed certain kind of restraints that resulted in establishing a symbiotic relationship with nature. Restraint in the sense that different kind of norms, different kind of customs and traditions emerged, which resulted in worshipping certain kind of animals, worshipping certain kind of trees, not harvesting in particular seasons, not cutting particular trees. So that kind of relationship with nature, that kind of symbolism with nature resulted in evolution of a sustainable relationship with nature, because now human society is considered as part of nature, and therefore society sustenance can be guaranteed only with sustenance of nature. Now when we come to the fourth mode of resource use, the industrial mode of resource use, perhaps by then society has changed a lot. Along with human power, or along with the muscle power and the animal power, perhaps new sources of energy were invented in this mode of resource use. Hydropower and fossil fuel especially became the great source of energy, which had an important impact on ecological impact and development of a particular kind of ideology in industrial society. With regard to its economy, as we know that the economy has become global, there has been intensification of resource use, and that has three specific characteristics. On the one hand, that resulted in intensification of resource use, because by now there has been development in transportation and communication, and it has been possible to reach nature which existed in a far off place. It has been possible to capture and control nature not only within the limited geographical area, but also from far off places. And as we just discussed, processes like colonialism, processes like imperialism, that resulted in large scale colonization of nature, and nature of far off places became an important ingredient for capitalist development of industrial societies, and that resulted in large scale production, and more importantly that also resulted in development or production of huge volumes of waste, and this industrial waste ultimately found their path again to the nature. So therefore industrial economy had, or in other words, the industrial mode of resource use emerged or developed a particular kind of ideology that had a severe impact on nature. With regard to ideology, perhaps industrial mode of resource use was completely different, totally different from the three other predecessors. In industrial mode of resource use, the dominant ideology that evolved is that of total rejection of the fact that, or the idea that human beings or human society is a part of nature. So there was a total separation of human society and the natural landscape. And not only there was a total separation, but humans were also considered as superior, humans also considered as separate from nature. So this separation of human society and nature perhaps intensified the control of nature, intensified the command and control of nature. So therefore the dominant ideology that emerged in the industrial mode of resource use is of commanding and controlling the nature, and considering humans as superior, and considering nature as a kind of element which exists for betterment of human society. So therefore nature is reduced to that of a raw material. Nature is reduced to that of an input which can be used in the production process. So this kind of ideology had a great impact on human beings' relationship with nature. This kind of ideology had a great impact in terms of human beings' interaction with nature. And the ideology that emerged in the industrial mode of resource use obviously impacted in a very severe way to the nature. So therefore the ecological impact of the industrial mode of resource use is perhaps the most severe in contrast to the other three modes of resource use. There is a large scale depletion of resources in ecological mode of resource use, and there is a radical modification of landscape. So the natural landscape was modified to a great extent, and perhaps it is not an exaggeration to say that none of the natural landscape remain any more natural. Perhaps capitalism or the global reach of capitalism has touched the far off forest, the most distant forest, and that resulted in large scale degradation, large scale depletion of nature. So to conclude, we may say that environmental history is a kind of discipline, or environmental history is a branch of knowledge which tries to understand the relationship between human society and nature from a historical perspective. So here the focus is not only on human society, not only on nature as a physical resource. For environmental history, nature becomes a space for contestation, nature becomes a space for cultural representation, nature becomes a space for symbolization, or nature becomes a space for symbolism. And environmental history in the South Asian context perhaps become more complex because of the complexities of the society as well as that of ecology. And the South Asian environmental history, or the Indian environmental history, especially focuses on elements like forest, water and grazing land. While focusing on forest, it tries to examine how a particular kind of human intervention in forest or a particular kind of management practice in forest has resulted in alteration of nature as well as change in social organization. So colonialization or colonialism becomes an important source for environmental history, and colonial environmental history especially focuses changes in the forest cover or changes in the natural resources as well as changes in human society. And when we see human society in a large historical framework, or when we try to examine the evolution of human society, perhaps we can do that with the help of Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil's framework of modes of resource use. And we identified 4 different modes of resource use: the gathering mode, the nomadic pastoralism mode, the settled agricultural mode, and the industrial mode. What is important in these 4 modes of resource use is that these 4 modes of resource use produce different kind of ideologies, and it is these ideologies which essentially govern human beings' relationship with nature. While nomadic pastoralism developed an ideology where human beings were considered as separate from nature, where no specific affinity could be developed with nature, that resulted in a specific kind of degradation of nature, a specific kind of ecological impact. Whereas in a settled cultivation or the settled cultivation mode of resource use, human beings tried to establish a symbiotic relationship with nature and evolved several norms, practices and traditions which resulted in evolution, or which resulted in emergence of several restraints in use of nature. There was restraints in which trees to be cut, there are restraints in which season in which trees cannot be cut, in which season certain kind of animals cannot be harvested, and it is these kind of restraints or these kind of cultural practices that resulted in a symbiotic relationship with nature, that resulted in a sustainable relationship with nature. And finally, when we come to the industrial mode of resource use, perhaps industrial mode of resource use produced an ideology where human beings were not only considered separate from nature, but were also considered as masters of nature, but were also considered as special elements in the ecosystem. Human beings are special because they have the ability to control nature, they have the ability to master nature. And perhaps it is this ideology which significantly influenced human beings' relationship with nature, which significantly influenced the use of nature. And it is this industrial mode of resource use that has resulted in large scale degradation of nature. And perhaps the most significant point that Ramchandra Guha highlights is that unlike Marxism, where industrial mode of production talks about capitalism, in this frame, industrial mode of resource use, it involves both the capitalist society as well as the socialistic societies. Because so far as the ideology of industrial resource use is concerned, there is no difference between capitalism and socialism, because both these two kinds of economic organizations believe in mastering and controlling the nature. Perhaps that is the most significant value addition or addition to the knowledge base of Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil's framework of modes of resource use. So while the capitalist mode of production in the Marxian sense talks about only the capitalist society, or the industrial mode of production talks about the capitalist society, the industrial mode of resource use talks about both capitalist society as well as the socialistic society. Because so far as the ideology is concerned, so far as the ecological impact is concerned, there is no difference in these two types of societies. Both socialism and capitalism produce a kind of ideology which believes in mastering the nature, controlling the nature and using the nature as a raw material, as an input in the production process. And consequently, both these types of social organization develop the similar ideology and develop the same kind of impact on nature. So the ecological impacts of capitalism is no way different from ecological impact of socialism. So finally, we may conclude that environmental history has emerged as an important interdisciplinary branch of knowledge which tries to study the past of human society in relation to nature. The basic readings that I have followed for this class are two important books. The book by Ramchandra Goa and David Arnold, Nature, Culture and Imperialism, and secondly the book by Ramchandra Goa and Madhav Gadgil, This Future Land, An Ecological History of India. Thank you.